Hello, dear colleagues. My name's Tetiana Cherednychok. I'm a localization expert in the Cherednychok localization community. I'm a member of that community. I've been a member of that community for 4 years now. And today we're gonna be discussing grammar of character gender in video games and how to deal with it. Particularly, we will talk about preparation for localization, how to manage Ukrainian and Russian grammar, how to find out a character's gender, how to address this character, and other tricky issues. Localization is a type of translation that is relatively young, and you might say at a first glance that it's nothing peculiar about it. Mostly it's about video games, so toying and playing, nothing serious. But in fact, it produces a lot of issues and challenges and obstacles. And from our experience, we would like to share some tips and tricks on negotiating those obstacles that you might encounter in the localization process. Oh, by the way, speaking of experience, July this year, Shlag celebrates 9 years of its existence. I'd like to congratulate the members of our mature community. I'd like to wish all the best, wish inspiration, and keep up the good work. It's a great pleasure for me to be a part of this team, to observe, to witness how it grows, and to witness the input of this community into our general purpose. We've managed a lot over these 9 years. I probably would not be able to talk through all the projects, but here's a short version of our portfolio. So over 9 years, we've worked with the Banner Saga, the Sinking City, Hand of Fate 2, Ruiner, Kingdom Come Deliverance, Going Home, Stanley Parable, Baldur's Gate, Summer Catchers, Metro 2033 and Metro Last Light, The Streets of Rage, Naval Action, and a variety of other projects. We've also worked on art books for Death Stranding, The Last of Us, Part 1 and Part 2, The Ghost of Tsushima, the Mass Effect trilogy, and others. Also, it's a great pleasure for me to work on art book localization, and I'd like to thank the Malopus company for this. Publishing company for this. So how we prepare for localization? To localize doesn't mean just to translate into a different language, but also to adapt certain elements to be better perceived by the end users of the localized product. Sometimes the language that we're translating into does not offer the same degree of freedom that the source language offers. That might result in certain issues when you're trying to convey meanings of words, convey certain proper names, certain aspects, and it also might result into dialect translation. So we need to be prepared for all of that, for all the tricky issues that a game has prepared for us. It's a good idea to play the game that you're localizing, or to watch walkthroughs or streams of the game that you're localizing. It's a very good idea to familiarize yourself with the world, with the storyline, with the characters. If a game was based on some sort of writing creation, it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with that. For example, when we were working on the Sinking City, developed by the Frogwares, a Ukrainian studio, we read some Lovecraft novels, and that allowed us to understand certain references in the game and to translate them correctly, convey them correctly. It's a great idea to use this because it's not often at our service. So what the preparation gives us, we find out what genre is the game, because the genres have their certain peculiar aspects. If a genre is something like, for example, if you work in a cyberpunk shooter, the lexicon used there will be different from a medieval setting game. That also allows us to find out what's the target audience, because the games for preschoolers is different from games for mature audiences. You can also find yourself translating a game that was not released yet, and you don't have any references about it, and you have to go through a lot of tiny pieces of announcements or trailers that will offer that tiny grain of knowledge that would come useful when you're working on the game. For instance, we've spotted an issue in one of the trailers when using one of the terms, and we've notified the developers about this issue, and that was corrected thanks to us. Those people who had experience in translating video games can tell that this is difficult. This is no game itself. You have you encounter certain issues with genders, issues with endings, etc., etc. We've discussed in our previous presentations with certain things related to dealing with endings, etc. Now we're going to talk about grammar. In a game, you can select a gender of your character, for instance. It's a simple decision in the game, but that leads to a lot of problems for localizers, and this could lead to certain grammatical and actual errors that would ruin your experience in the game. To make sure that you understand all the peculiar things in the localization and to foresee any possible issues in the future, we need to understand that Ukrainian language and Russian language, despite being a part of Indo-European family, but they're inflective languages, and the English language is analytical language, while Ukrainian language is synthetical. In one language, the meaning is conveyed through the order of words, and the other one conveys it through word endings. These are grammar differences, and based on this, we can say that in English, unlike in Ukrainian, they don't have genders, and in English, it's almost impossible to figure out the gender of a person who is talking and a person that is being talked to. In Ukrainian language, there are 7 cases that affect the adjectives, nouns, verbs have different genders or declinate as per genders, and a tiny number of infinitives. And all of this affects the localization process that we have to take into account all those problems. So why grammar matters? There are games where the player can select a character, while there are other games where you are playing as a predetermined character. For example, Charles Lee from The Sinking City or Amelie from King's Bounty. Those are pre-made characters. That makes the process of translation easier because you don't have to figure out the gender of the main character, and that simplifies translation of his replicas, his dialogues or her dialogues. But if you're translating an NPC's dialogue, or if one NPC talks to another NPCs, and the main character is not a part of this dialogue at all, or if you're followed by your companions, and those companions talk to each other, and they talk to each other all together. And also the game can use certain names as placeholders in strings. There is no universal solution, of course, and you have to look through each and every case separately. So we will try and learn how to manage all these baffling issues when a localizer is working on a certain game. One of the scenarios, when you know the name of a character but you don't know whether that's a male or a female. It's an example from the Assassin's Creed Valhalla art book. The main character is Eivor. He was initially a female, but then the developers decided to give a player a capability to select whether that's a male or a female, but the name remained a female name.
In the book, it is most often a female, but there are pages when we can see that it's a male character. So we had to adjust the translation to match either one, or somehow phrase it in a way that would correspond to the context and give us flexibility. So sometimes we're not as lucky with the context. So there are different ways to go about it. For example, if it is something that's already been released, you can try Googling it. Searching the internet for articles, for mentions in the forum posts, something else that you can find. If it is a new game that is about to be released, and there's not much info available, then you can use what you can find in the announcements, in the ads of the developers. And if you don't find anything, resort to plan B. You ask the developer. But you don't want to keep asking them every time about every tiny thing, so it is wise to prepare a file that would be accessed by all the participants, the translators, the developers, and you can put there your questions and discuss it together. Option 3 is not that it is rather apparent, maybe not so much to those who are new to the profession, but anyway, consult with your colleagues. I mean, go and ask for help, for advice when you find yourself in this kind of predicament. Option 4 is be a detective. If anything else fails, imagine that you are an investigator. Search the text for the name of the character, for some clues that would help you understand and localize better. Now, what else could happen? Sometimes it is a completely new character and we have no idea what their gender is. So how do we go about it? If, for example, it's a game where the player selects the gender, or if there are different options to go, it is a puzzler, but there are ways, again, to deal with it. Usually, if you, again, search on the internet, not just for the character if it's a new character, but for some comments from those who already played the game, and that could also be a clue for you. Or, I mean, that would work if it's a certain, if this character has a certain gender. Or you look for something neutral, depending on the context. Let's look at some more examples, just to give you a better idea. So we need to be careful with both of these sentences, or questions, rather. One looks pretty simple, the first one. The other one leaves some room for interpretation in Ukrainian, because again, there's the gender issue. So this is how we suggest we translate it in a more neutral way that would allow us to have two grammatically correct sentences that are gender neutral. Option number 3 also helps us deal with the localization, the gender part of localization. We can play with the time, I mean, change the past to present, such as in this example. As I was dozing off, name approached me. We don't know the gender, and we don't know who was dozing off, so we cannot use a respective verb in Ukrainian with a specific ending. So we go for a neutral form instead. If it's an NPC mentioned in this sentence, again we go for a neutral phrasing, gender neutral, and so we keep it throughout the segment. Now, another case that could be a problem for the translator when they localize. In English, the pronoun you could stand both for the singular or plural, and so in Ukrainian, oftentimes we face this challenge. How do we translate as you wish, singular or plural? Here's what you can do. You can opt for the polite pronoun. In Ukrainian, it would still be translated as you, and it could work for you. But then again, if it's a character that is being rude, then this would not work. For example, here, hey, you fool. Again, if it's a character that, if it's a character and they are being addressed, as we can see in Ukrainian, if it's a pre-selected or predetermined gender, then we can see from the noun and take it from there. But if not, they will be you will not be using the polite pronoun, such as, or the polite address, the Mr. or my lady, things like that. So you would go for something that is more simple. Then again, if you're asking, are you sure you want to quit the game? This is where the polite pronoun would work. But it's not a magic pill again, because there could be several characters addressed at once. Then again, you should look for the context and figure out who is this character talking to, this other character, I mean. You can always go neutral, such as here, for example, as you wish, you can go for either. And for hey, you fool, you could go for a more appropriate Ukrainian equivalent. Then the vocative case, we have it in Ukrainian, but in English they don't. So sometimes they work, this case, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Such as in the first line here. Usually we do not change the variable, but again, things can be different if it's a name or a race. Sometimes it is included just to give better connection with this character, or it is something that is inserted culturally. So if you are 100% sure you will not do any damage, you can just drop it. But before you do that, you should consult with your supervisor, with a project manager, with someone in charge. In this line at the top, you can just leave out the name and it would still make sense. But if it is an NPC, you cannot leave it out because otherwise we will not be able to tell who the character, the player, is talking to or about. Now, is in the second segment, as we can see, the race is involved, and the vocative case once again. So this noun, if it's an elf, would have a different ending for feminine and masculine gender. So we need to either be sure about the gender, or we can just leave it out again if it would not cause considerable or material damage. Something seems to be wrong with the slides here. Anyway. Regarding hold citizen, there are no variables here, but it does not really make it any more simple to, or any easier to make it neutral. You can just say hold it. It would make it less official, less formal, compared with the original. But sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the sake of clarity and to avoid grammatical errors. Now, this citizen part can also be conveyed through pardon or come again, something like that. Okay, I'm trying to figure out what's with my slides here. Anyway, there will be no dessert apparently, because that case was my dessert. So let me just sum up and conclude traditionally by thanking our partners, the crowding team, who make it much easier for us to localize the words. We are extremely grateful to this team for their help and support, and we wish them best of luck. That was all from me. Let's keep localization into Ukrainian going. We have a question. Hello. Thank you. It was a great pleasure to listen to your presentation. I have two questions. Question number one, I mean, if you have some kind of standards for this, do you go Ukrainian all the way when you localize? Because youth these days, they tend to use lots of English borrowings. I mean, they just say shooter. and they use a derivative from angry instead of using the Ukrainian equivalent. I mean, it drives me crazy, but there's nothing I can do about it. Anyway, so you said that when we localize or translate browser apps, I know that there can be different files for the feminine and masculine translation. Is it different for the game somehow? Thank you for your question.
Thanks for your question. I'll start with the second one because it's going to be brief. It happens in a variety of versions. You can have two strings, one for feminitives, second for masculines. But often you encounter a situation when you have only one version of interpreting. If you have two columns, no problem whatsoever. But if you have one string that has to fit all the options, we need to find our way out of it. As for the first question, all those words, all those English hybrids in our language, we take those words into our language from English, and it's a normal process. Those can be treated as a slang words, because I'm not sure if in a classic language you can encounter being angry as agrica and other English words, but we are striving to make our translations as naturally feeling as possible. And we are striving to adhering grammar norms in our translation. If it fits the context to use a slang word, we will use it. For instance, if we were translating the Ruiner cyberpunk shooter, we had strings that we would not be able to formulate that using classic literature language. A completely different situation is in the Baldur's Gate game. I think it's a matter of habit. As far as I can tell from my experience, people used to call gameplay as gameplay. Now we're translating these words. Same applies to the game engine. People translate that as движок, which is a kind of a slangish word. We now use, and I myself use another word for it. So it's a gradual process. It's a long way. Thing is, we don't have any sort of dictionary at the moment that saying that this word like damage should be translated like this, or shooter genre should be translated like this. It's a difficult process. We have to maintain purity of our language, and we want to do that, but we are not very successful at this point. Thank you. Tanya, hello, it's a pleasure to meet you here. Send my regards to all your localization community, especially to Andrei Pekar. Thanks for popularizing Ukrainian language in this sphere. I, with pleasure, read the art books that you are translating and localizing, and I want to see some comic books localized into your language. Thanks a lot. And any other questions, maybe? It seems to be none. Thank you, Tetiana. Thanks a lot for your presentation. It was a very interesting one.